Welcome to Heart of the West, where every mark tells a tale. Winter's breath descended upon Thornfield Valley like scattered cinders, gentle yet relentless, wrapping the settlement in hushed stillness as though the season itself had grown weary of humanity's violence and sought to blanket it all in merciful quiet. This was a place cobbled together from decay and stubbornness, where sagging wooden porches groaned beneath unspoken truths and the chapel bell had fallen silent since the minister's bride perished 6 harsh winters past. In this barren season, few dared venture into the streets without purpose, yet there she was. Elena cross-moved with deliberate slowness, each footfall heavier than the last. Her woolen wrap clung to her like a shroud of humiliation. The marks beneath that thick gray fabric remained hidden, but concealment proved unnecessary. The townsfolk had always known. They witnessed it all: the swollen flesh around her eye, the careful way she guarded her ribs when bitter wine struck too fiercely. These details caught the attention of Thornfield's women as they peered through frost-covered glass, pretending blindness. Their silence preserved their own fragile peace. The merchant's apprentice stopped clearing slush from his doorstep, glanced upward briefly, then averted his gaze. Mrs. Catherine Moore observed from her parlor window, lips pressed into a disapproving line, fingers worrying the silver pendant at her throat. "Always been strange, that one," she murmured to the empty air. "Too delicate for a brute like Samuel Cross. Some ladies simply attract misfortune." Elena couldn't catch these whispered judgments, but their sting reached her nonetheless. In communities such as this, condemnation found its target whether voiced aloud or merely thought. She pressed on toward the trading post, stepped across the threshold, and fixed her eyes upon the wooden planks below. Warmth enveloped her like a half-remembered dream, faint, foreign, treacherous. Old Morrison behind the counter offered no smile, merely a single nod that acknowledged something shameful. "Got grain," he muttered gruffly. "And medical supplies." She opened her weathered palm, revealing 2 tarnished coins. "Insufficient for both necessities." Morrison paused, then pushed the bandages toward her. "Reckon you'll need these more urgent-like," she acknowledged with tight lips and turned to depart. As she reached the entrance, her shoulder collided with someone entering, a towering, deliberate figure wrapped in bearskin, frost clinging to his dark whiskers. He carried the scent of evergreens and wood smoke. No apology passed his lips. None was expected. Marcus Stone had descended from the high country. Most folks questioned his existence until confronting him face to face. He spoke rarely, never, lingered, and moved through settlements like living legend, a myth wandering through spaces too confined to contain him. Some claimed he'd once served God, others whispered he'd murdered his own kin. All agreed he possessed a dangerous quality that required no evidence. His gaze lingered on Elena for a heartbeat. Not with Samuel's predatory hunger, all teeth and appetite, but with something quieter, recognition, perhaps, as one might observe a winter tree and still envision its spring blossoms. Elena continued walking. By the time she reached her dwelling, wind had intensified and twilight painted the sky deep purple. The homestead teetered 3 planks shy of complete collapse, a structure built by hands more familiar with cruelty than craftsmanship. She pushed through the door and stepped inside. The stench struck her immediately: liquor, perspiration, and bitter fury. Thomas sat beside the fireplace, boots caked with mud, shirt hanging open. He was Samuel's younger brother, yet more vicious, a coward who discovered bravery only among those weaker than himself. "Well, look what finally dragged itself home," he slurred. "Thought maybe you'd frozen solid out there. Would have spared us considerable trouble." Elena remained silent. She placed the medical supplies on the rough table and moved toward the cooking stove. "You even expressed gratitude to Samuel for not feeding you to the wolves yet?" Thomas called after her. "You're pathetic." "Always have been." She struck a match with trembling fingers. The flame wavered, then steadied. Footsteps approached from behind, too close. She tensed. His hand seized her shoulder, spinning her around roughly. "Don't turn away when I'm speaking," he thought himself. Too superior to acknowledge him now, his breath reeked. His grip tightened menacingly. "I wasn't," she began, but the strike landed before her words could form. She stumbled backward, colliding with the stove hard enough to send the kettle crashing. The metallic clang echoed through the cabin. He advanced closer. "Please," she whispered. Thomas had already decided. Violence possessed its own rhythm, and men like him couldn't tolerate when that beat was disrupted. Hours later, when stars clawed through storm clouds and silence once again blanketed the world, Elena sat on the barn floor, concealed behind hay bales, clutching her ribs. They felt like broken glass floating within her chest. Her lip had split, one eye swelling shut, yet she shed no tears. Those had dried up years ago. She listened to wind whistling through gaps in the boards, to the occasional snort from the horses, to the ghosts that whispered in her blood. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl cried out a sound of warning. Marcus stood just beyond the settlement's edge, leaning against the weathered boundary marker near the cemetery. Snow clung to his broad shoulders like divine judgment. He hadn't intended to remain, but something in Elena's silence had lodged itself in him like a thorn. He recalled once caring for a hawk with a shattered wing. It hadn't made a sound, but its eyes had blazed with life. Elena's eyes held that same fire. Even when the rest of her barely existed, he turned back toward the mountains. Elena dreamed of drowning, of being held underwater by hands she'd once trusted. She awakened gasping in the straw, pain stabbing her side, tasting copper in her mouth. Outside, wind howled like a mother grieving something she couldn't protect. In town, Mrs. Moore penned a letter to her relative in Colorado. "Poor girls run off with that mountain savage, I suspect," she wrote. "No virtue left in these parts." But Elena hadn't fled. Not yet. She still clutched the matchbox, fingers raw from cold and injury. She still hummed melodies under her breath, not from faith, but because the rhythm steadied her fractured spirit. Samuel returned before dawn, slamming the barn door wide with bloodshot eyes and frozen spurs. "Think you can hide from me, woman?" he snarled. "Think Marcus Stone's gonna rescue you? He's a beast. A freak. No real man would want damaged goods like you." She looked up at him quietly, then rose to her feet. That seemed to enrage him more than anything. She didn't scream when he grabbed her, didn't plead. The only sound was her ribs grinding beneath his grip. When he dropped her in the snow, she remained motionless for a long while, breathing through clenched teeth, eyes fixed on the ridge beyond town where trees grew thick and no one watched. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He listened to the wind, and somewhere far below, something within Elena Cross finally snapped. Not in surrender, but in resolution. Come morning, she would not return to the settlement, not to the store, not to the bruises, not to people who blamed her for her own tragedy. She would go, broken or not, northward toward the place where legends claimed the mountain, breathed and watched and waited. She didn't know what awaited her there, but she hoped for something gentler than agony. And in the distance, Marcus Stone lit his lantern as if he sensed someone was finally beginning their journey. Elena's breathing came in ragged gasps, each inhalation slicing through her lungs like blades drawn across ice. Wind shrieked through the forest, speaking warnings in tongues older than memory. Her shawl had torn somewhere near the creek, her boots too fragile for such terrain, bleeding warmth into the snow with every faltering step. Yet still she pressed forward, ribs grinding, lips cracked, her silence more determined than any cry. She'd lost track of time. Hours had collapsed beneath her, crushed by pain and cold and the singular desperate truth keeping her upright. She could never return. Behind her, Thornfield Valley disappeared into snow and shadow, a place that wore its cruelty beneath polite smiles and clasped hands. She'd left nothing behind but blood in the barn hay and a name folks would whisper like a curse. Ahead, the mountains rose like ancient deities, watching with their slow, breathless patience. She aimed for them not because she believed salvation waited within, but because they represented the only place Samuel Cross's hands couldn't reach her. If death awaited up there, at least it would be clean. The ground shifted suddenly. Her foot caught a root, and she plummeted hard into the drift. Agony exploded through her shoulder. She couldn't rise. Wind pressed around her, cold and final, Then it changed. Boots crunched nearby, measured and heavy. She attempted to lift her head, but her body refused. Her cheek pressed into the snow, lashes clumped with frost, a shadow eclipsed the gray sky. Then came warmth, rough wool, strong arms, a scent of pine smoke, sweat, and the faintest trace of something ancient and wild. Marcus Stone spoke not a word as he knelt. He simply slid one arm beneath her shoulders and another beneath her knees, lifting her like a bundle of kindling. Her eyes fluttered open once, enough to see his jaw clenched, the flicker of a frown beneath his beard. Then she slipped into deeper darkness. She awakened to heat caressing her skin gently. A fire crackled nearby, its amber light dancing against log walls. Above, wind beat against the roof, but it felt distant now, like an old song. She lay upon a bed layered with furs. A wool blanket weighed her down, heavy enough to stop her shivering. Her wounds ached, but less intensely. The bandages were fresh, clean, properly tied. Someone had washed the blood from her face. She blinked slowly. The cabin was modest, one room, a hearth, a table with 3 chairs, though only one showed where. From use, along the back wall stood a shelf of books, a Bible among them. A rifle leaned near the door. A kettle hung above the fire, and across from her, sitting in a chair with a blade in one hand and a block of cedar in the other, was Marcus. He didn't look up. He whittled with long, quiet strokes, wood curling off the edge and falling to the floor like autumn leaves. His coat hung beside the door, heavy with melted snow. Elena tried to speak, but pain lanced through her throat too sharply. He stopped carving, met her gaze. His voice was low, deep, and didn't ask permission to exist. "You're safe." She nodded slightly. "Won't ask where you came from," he added. "Ain't my concern." She wanted to thank him, but her lips cracked when she moved them. He stood, crossed to the kettle, poured warm broth into a tin cup, and offered it to her with careful hands. She accepted it, fingers brushing his. The heat flowed through her like firelight into a frozen house. She sipped slowly. "I'm Marcus," he said after a long pause. "Most call me Stone. You don't have to." She looked at him again. His face wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either. There were scars, yes, but they'd healed cleanly. His eyes were dark, quiet, not the piercing kind, but the kind that remained. "I'm Elena," she whispered, the word tasting like something from another existence. He nodded once as if he'd known all along. The days that followed flowed like a slow river. Marcus didn't pressure her with questions. He gave her time. Sometimes he ventured out, returning with wood or game or silence. Other times he stayed close, working with his hands mending boots, cleaning his rifle, carving utensils from old branches. She noticed the care in everything he did. The way he cleaned his boots before entering. The way he placed her food on the table, then stepped back, letting her choose whether to eat. Her body healed slowly, like winter's thaw. Each bruise faded like a dying star. The cracked ribs still burned when she breathed deeply, but breathing had become less of a chore, more of a promise. On the 4th morning, she attempted standing. Pain swarmed up her side and she swayed. Marcus caught her by the elbow, steadying her without meeting her eyes. "I can manage," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "I know," he replied. Then he let go. That night, she crept to the door and opened it just a crack. Wind moaned through the trees. The sky was full of stars scattered like shattered glass. She leaned against the frame, watched her breath drift out like smoke, and tried to remember what hope had once felt like. Inside, Marcus was stirring stew. He glanced up but didn't speak. She returned to her chair near the fire. Silence passed between them, not awkward, not heavy. "Just shared? You live here alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Why?" He thought for a moment. "Because I'm not suited for other folks." She studied him. "You don't seem dangerous." "I didn't say. I was." She let that hang there. The truth was, Marcus felt safer than any man she'd known. Later, she found a book on the table worn, dog-eared, Psalms. Inside the front cover was his name, written in a steady, practiced hand. She didn't ask if he'd once been a preacher. The sorrow in his posture told her enough. One morning, she folded a shirt he'd left near the hearth and mended a torn seam. Left it folded on his chair. He didn't say thank you. But the next day, her shawl hung mended on the peg near the door. Their language became gestures. She restocked the woodpile. He left a sprig of wild mint by her cup. She swept the cabin floor. He built a second chair smaller than his, just her size. In town, gossip spread like oil on water. She's gone, the whole girl, Mrs. Moore clucked. Run off with that mountain brute, no doubt. Samuel and Thomas didn't speak of it, but they drank harder, rode through town with eyes like broken glass. They wanted their property back not from love, but because she'd embarrassed them. Their pride limped like a wounded dog. In the cabin, Elena found rhythm. Each day her steps grew stronger. She began feeding the chickens Marcus kept behind the ridge. She chopped vegetables for stew. Her laughter, still rare, sometimes, slipped out without warning. And Marcus watched her like a man watching spring approach after a long, cruel winter, careful not to move too fast, lest it vanish again. One evening she found him out back chopping wood with slow, steady swings. She stepped close, holding out a tin cup of coffee. He took it, and their fingers brushed again. "I never thanked you," she said. "You don't owe me that." "I know, but I wanted to." He drank, then handed the cup back. "You planning on heading back?" She shook her head. "There's nothing to go back to." He met her gaze. "You don't have to stay either. Snow will lift in a few weeks. You'll be strong enough to go wherever you want." She hesitated. "And if I wanted to stay?" His eyes softened, though his face didn't change. "Then I'd build another room." They stood there in the cold steam rising from the coffee between them. No declarations, no promises, just a quiet thing beginning to take root. That night, as wind thrashed the cabin and fire warmed the walls, Elena sat with the Psalms open in her lap. She read aloud, not to him, not to herself, but to the silence. And Marcus sat nearby, listening with his eyes closed. Out in the woods, something shifted. Not danger, not threat, but the quiet breath of a world beginning again. And though the mountain still watched, its gaze felt gentler now, like it had witnessed this before and knew what came next. By the time snow began softening into mud, word had already outpaced spring. Elena Cross was alive, and she was with Marcus Stone on the ridge. That alone would have been enough to stir the blood of Thornfield Valley. But details changed with each retelling. In the saloon, they claimed she'd been bewitched. Marcus had lured her with mountain spells and devil's whispers. At the trading post, it was whispered she'd seduced him. A broken woman using her pain to crawl inside a man's good heart and rot it out. At the church, Mrs. Moore folded her hands and spoke of sin, of women who wander and the men who catch them. None of them spoke of Samuel Cross's fists. None spoke of the barn or the bruises. None asked why a woman would rather freeze on a mountain than stay warm in her husband's house. Samuel said nothing for a time, not because he was finished, only because he was coiling. Marcus and Elena did not return to town. The days on the ridge passed slow and full. Snow melted off the porch roof in steady drops, ticking out a rhythm that reminded Elena of childhood lullabies. Each morning she woke with her own breath, unhurried. Each night she closed her eyes without fear of waking in pain. She swept the floors. She stitched. She planted seeds along the cabin's edge, fingers deep in soft earth, and Marcus built. He added a room not for her, but for space, for air. He didn't tell her what it meant, and she didn't ask. But when the walls were up and she stood in that empty space with the scent of fresh-cut pine in her nose, she whispered thanks to the frame and pressed her hand to it like a blessing. They rarely touched. Only when needed, a hand steadying a shoulder, a cup passed between fingers. But the quiet between them had thickened into something more than silence. It held weight, shape, warmth. One morning, she handed him a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth for his knee, which she'd noticed ached after long walks. He nodded, tucked it into his coat pocket, and said nothing. That afternoon he came back with a carved figure in his hand, small, delicate, a hawk in flight. He left it by her sewing basket. The hawk became her favorite thing, but spring also brought watchers. Riders passed beneath the ridge twice in 1 week, men pretending to hunt. though they carried empty rifles and left no tracks of game behind. Once Elena saw the glint of a spyglass through the trees. She didn't say anything until Marcus stepped in that evening, snow on his boots, and looked at her long. "They're watching," she said. "I know. Will they come?" He didn't answer right away. He poured water into the tin wash basin, rolled up his sleeves, and scrubbed the dirt from his hands as if it might carry poison. "They will," she waited. "Will you fight them, if I must?" Her voice dropped. "For me?" Marcus looked up then, water dripping from his fingers. "For what's right?" That night she sat by the fire and held the hawk in her palm. It was smooth now, the edges worn by her thumb. She didn't feel fragile anymore. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer lived at the surface. It had sunk down, hardened into something that resembled strength, but the town did not forgive quiet healing. Mrs. Moore stood on the church steps the next Sunday, hands folded tight, eyes scanning the pews like a buzzard circling bone. "She was always a prideful girl," she murmured to the crowd. "Now she's given herself over to savagery and will be judged by it." Samuel sat in the back, chewing a toothpick to pulp. Thomas leaned beside him, nursing the last of his bruises, still unable to close one eye all the way. "They think she's safe up there," Samuel muttered. "She ain't." Marcus sharpened his blade at dusk, the scraping sound crisp and slow. Elena watched from the door, a basket of kindling at her hip. She didn't ask what he planned. She only said, "We should be ready. I am." She thought of the town, how it folded back so neatly, how it carried judgment in every handshake. She thought of the women who looked away when her lip was split, of the sheriff who said it was a domestic matter, of the man she'd married because there were no other choices in a place like Thornfield Valley. And she thought of this man scarred and silent, building rooms without asking for her past. She touched the hawk again that night before sleeping, slipped it beneath her pillow like a charm. 3 nights later the storm rolled in. Lightning lit the cabin in bursts. Thunder pealed across the ridge like warning drums. Elena bolted upright before the first knock hit the door. She knew it was coming before it came. She'd dreamed it more than once. Marcus was already standing. The second knock wasn't a knock, it was a fist. "Elena!" Samuel's voice muffled by wind and fury. "You come out here right now? You hear me? You bring that beast out with you?" Marcus didn't move. She reached for his arm. "Don't open it." "I won't." Then came Thomas's voice. "Sheriff says you kidnapped her, Stone. Says you're harboring a criminal. You told him I ran," she whispered, horrified. "You think they'd admit you walked?" Marcus said. He pulled a coat over his shoulders, then turned to her and held out a hand. She looked at it, then took it. They stepped outside together into the teeth of the storm. Rain came sideways, lashing. Torches flickered in the wind, held by men who thought their hate would keep them warm. Samuel stood out front, soaked to the bone, but smiling, that kind of smile wolves wear when they think you're cornered. "You've got 5 seconds, he said. "Send her back or we come get her." Marcus didn't flinch. "She's not yours." "She's my wife." Samuel stepped forward. Thomas raised his rifle, hands shaking. "One of the other men, young Becker, the grocer's?" Son looked unsure, glancing behind him as though he hadn't signed up for this brand of courage. "She belongs in town," Samuel said. Elena raised her voice. "I belong nowhere." The men stopped. "I bled in your barns and you looked away," she said. "I screamed inside your walls and you prayed louder. I walked broken and you called me quiet, but I'm not quiet anymore." Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. Samuel reached for her. Marcus moved. He didn't draw his blade. He didn't punch or shout. He stepped between them with the weight of a mountain, slow and unyielding, his eyes locked with Samuel's. And what passed between them was not rage, it was promise. "You lay hands on her again," Marcus said, "and I'll break you where you stand. Not fast, not like a mercy, like memory." Samuel's hand trembled. His pride roared, but his body betrayed it. He stepped back. Thomas looked between them, then dropped the rifle. The other men followed. One by one, the torches fell into the mud. Elena exhaled for the first time in days. Samuel stood alone. "You'll regret this," he spat. You already do, Marcus said. The rain swallowed him. Later they sat by the fire, both soaked and silent. Elena peeled off her shawl. Marcus passed her a towel. She rubbed her arm slowly, as if reclaiming her skin. You didn't hurt him, she said. I wanted to. I know. I'd do worse if he comes back. She looked at him. The hawk sat on the table. Between them, Marcus, she said softly. Would you really break him slow? He met her gaze. Not for revenge, he said. For remembering. They didn't speak again that night. But something passed between them, something fuller than the quiet they'd shared before. A kind of trust that doesn't come from safety, but from choosing to stand beside someone when the world expects you to run. And above the cabin, the mountain seemed to breathe out long and slow, like even it understood what had been decided. The forest held its breath. Dawn broke slow over Thornfield Valley, not in brilliance, but in bruised light. Ash-gray clouds rolled over peaks, and snow flurried just enough to hush footsteps. The world seemed to wait, like even the trees knew what was coming. Elena stood barefoot in the frostbitten earth behind the cabin, Marcus's horn in her hands. She wore her old shawl, the one torn at the hem where Samuel's boot had caught it, the one she'd mended twice but never worn again. Now she wore it like a final act. Her breath ghosted in front of her, but she didn't shiver. From the ridge she saw them ride in four dark shapes against a dull sky. Samuel led, eyes narrowed, jaw set like stone carved wrong. Thomas beside him, favoring a leg Marcus had already bruised once. The other two were locals Becker and Luke Hensley. Not evil men, just weak ones. Men who followed rage because it was louder than reason. They dismounted slowly, scanning the quiet cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady. The door stood slightly ajar, swaying like an invitation. Stay sharp, Samuel barked. He's up there somewhere, Thomas grinned. Maybe he's sleeping in. We'll make this real easy. Shut your mouth, Samuel hissed. Elena took one step forward out from the trees. Her shawl fluttered in the wind, and her pale figure looked ghostly in the snow. One hand held the horn, the other hung at her side. All four men froze. Samuel's jaw went slack. You're not supposed to be here yet, she said softly. Her voice didn't tremble. I hadn't finished praying. Thomas lifted his rifle. She's baiting us. She blew the horn. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound carried like a mountain's. Warning deep and ancient dot, then the woods cracked open. Marcus came down the ridge without haste. He didn't run, didn't shout. He moved like winter coming from the trees inevitable and godless. His coat billowed behind him like a broken banner. One hand carried the axe, the other a long-bladed hunting knife. Becker turned pale. Hell no. Marcus was on him before the words left his throat. One blow sent the boy to his knees, breath gone. Marcus didn't even glance at him. Samuel swung his rifle. You savage bastard! Marcus batted it aside. The edge of his axe met Samuel's wrist. Bone cracked like dry kindling. Samuel screamed. The rifle dropped into snow. Thomas lunged. His blade found Marcus's shoulder, but barely buried an inch before. Marcus caught his arm. Then came the silence, not from fear, but from precision. Marcus twisted Thomas's wrist backward slowly, deliberately, until the joint gave a wet pop. Thomas howled. That's one, Marcus said. He brought his knee up hard into the man's ribs. Once, twice. That's two. He dragged Thomas down by the collar and whispered something only the broken man heard. Thomas pissed himself. Samuel tried crawling. Marcus stepped over him and knelt beside Elena instead. You ready? He asked. She looked at the ring on her finger-tarnished gold. Her voice was gentle. Take it off me. Marcus did, careful not to touch her skin. He held the band between thumb and forefinger, then pressed it into the snow. He buried it there under his palm. Elena stared at the spot a moment. It's done, she said. No, ma'am, Marcus murmured. It's just begun. He dragged Samuel and Thomas to their feet, tied them by the wrists with coarse hemp. Neither resisted. One of them whimpered. The others were gone. Ben had run, Luke too. Marcus turned toward town. Elena, he said. She nodded. They walked down the mountain side by side, wind pressing at their backs. No one spoke. Thornfield Valley sat quiet that morning. The townfolk were already gathered in the square. Mrs. Moore had seen the smoke signal from the ridge and declared a town prayer. When Marcus stepped into view, dragging Samuel and Thomas like dead deer behind a mule, no one breathed. The sheriff stepped out first, looking older than he had 2 days ago. Marcus dropped the rope and let the Cross brothers fall in the dirt. "These men broke a woman's bones," he said, then said she was theirs. The crowd shifted. "They did it smiling," Elena added. Her voice rang through the street. They laughed. While I bled, no one met her eyes. Not yet. She ran off, Mrs. Moore called. "But what's this got to do with us?" Marcus turned to her slowly. "You prayed louder when she screamed." The wind stilled. Marcus turned to the sheriff. "Will you jail them, or shall the mountain keep them?" The sheriff looked at the crowd, at the hollow faces and downturned eyes, at Mrs. Moore, then at Elena. "We'll jail them," he said. Elena nodded. Samuel and Thomas were hauled away not by Marcus, but by Ben and Luke, who had reappeared on the edges of the crowd. Heads hung. Marcus looked down at Elena. "You want to stay?" She looked at the town. At the store where no one ever asked about her bruises, at the church door that closed in her face. No, they turned back toward the ridge. But the next Sunday, when Elena stepped into town, shoulders squared, head high, they didn't close the church door. She didn't go inside, but she left a scarf on the pew. That was enough. Marcus never spoke. Of what came after, he didn't have to. The mountain held memory like bedrock, and the scars on his arms were testimony enough. They built a new cabin higher up, where sun caught the roof first and the trees sang in the wind. Marcus carved 2 chairs for the fire. Elena filled the shelves with books. She read aloud sometimes, her voice low and strong psalms, stories. "Poetry?" Once a hawk circled overhead, she laughed. "There he is," she said, and set the carved hawk on the windowsill facing the sun. Marcus smiled but didn't answer. They didn't speak of love, not in words, they didn't need to. He tended her garden when she limped. She mended his coat when the thread gave. And when storms came, they sat beside each other and waited not in fear, but in knowing. Because some storms don't come to destroy. Some come to clear the ground for something stronger. And for those watching from far off, for the ones who've been broken and bent, silent and small, Elena leaves a whisper in every fire's crackle. There's a kind of strength that doesn't shout, that doesn't ride in fast or draw first. It grows quiet like fire beneath snow. And when it comes, it doesn't come for revenge. It comes for dignity. So if you ever see someone walk with their head low, remember some bones men stronger than they ever were.